and we will get started. So, like I said, this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his life, legacy, and connections to Philadelphia. So, other than the obvious reason why being American, why I am connected to this topic, when I was a junior, between my junior and senior year, I had this opportunity to participate in a program called Operation Understanding. It started in 1985 by a congressman named William Gray and a businessman named George Ross. And a part of the reason why they started this was that they were noticing the breakdown in communication and the working together between the Black community and the Jewish community. So they started this program in 1985 to kind of heal the divide and to have young people build these bonds and take these roles of leadership. So during the summer, during my junior and senior year, I had the opportunity to spend 5 weeks on a bus. We went from New York all the way down to the deep South, and we went to sites of significance for both the Black community and for the Jewish community. And we learned about how we worked together during the civil rights movement and beyond. And when we came back during our senior year, we traveled around doing presentations on this topic, our experiences, but also about the civil rights movement then and now. So these are two pictures of that experience. Like I said, I was a junior in high school, so not all of the pictures are going to be nice and neat. It was in the middle of summer in July and August. So the top picture was at Sylvia's, which is a very famous Black restaurant in Harlem, where a lot of civil rights things have happened. And the bottom picture was actually from the Virginia Holocaust Museum, which if you ever have the opportunity to go to, I would highly recommend it. That we had the opportunity to actually meet some survivors from the Holocaust. They gave us a tour, and then we sat down and we had dinner with them. So this is partially my connection, other than just being an American, to this topic. But enough about me. I'm going to move on to Martin Luther King Jr. So he was born in 1929. And to give it a little context, some of the other people who were born in 1929 was Anne Frank. I think when we think of Anne Frank and we think of Martin Luther King, we definitely think of two completely different time periods, but two people who definitely had an impact. So there's Anne Frank, Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, Barbara Walters, and Jackie O were all born in that year. He was born to Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. So one of the things that not everyone knows is when Martin Luther King was actually born, his name was Michael. He was actually Michael King Jr. His father went to Europe and had a pilgrimage and kind of an epiphany about the work of Martin Luther. And when he came back, he changed his name, and he also changed his son's name. So Martin was his first son, but the second child. Their first child was Christine King, who was born on September 11th in 1927. And she, again, is the eldest, and she's still living. She is also known as Willie. There is Alfred King, who was the youngest, and he was born in 1930, so Martin was in the middle of the two. He unfortunately died in 1969. He was also known as A.D. King. Unfortunately, he drowned in a pool a year after his brother was killed, so there was a lot of tragedy there. Another thing that not everyone knows is that Alberta King was actually assassinated. So she was killed in 1974, and she was at her piano at Ebenezer, which is the church that Martin Luther King's father was a preacher at, and she was executed by an extremist from the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. There is a very powerful book called Three Mothers that talks about Alberta. It talks about the mother of Malcolm X as well as Jane Baldwin, which are all definitely big figures in the civil rights movement during that era, and how their mothering, how their lives have affected these three men. So I would definitely recommend that. And any of the books or anything of my references that I make reference to, I will be sending out afterwards. So you don't have to take notes about that. So he had a very loving childhood filled with piano lessons and family and friends. And then in September 20th, 1944, he starts Morehouse University. Morehouse is actually where his father graduated from. So if you notice, he was only 15 years old when he started at Morehouse. And that's because of two things. One is that he skipped his freshman year of high school because the school he was supposed to go to was shut down and combined with another. So they just put him into sophomore year. And during that time, there was also a war going on, and they were, after a couple of years, there was a war going on. There was a drop in enrollment in colleges, and so they were letting people who were promising students into colleges early. So he basically skipped his freshman year and he skipped his senior year. And that's a part of the reason why he started at Morehouse in 1944 at 15 years old. When he enrolled, he did not want to follow in the footsteps of his father, which is in the ministry. He ended up being a sociology major. But during this time, with his friendship with the people there, as well as the mentorship of the president of the college, he ended up seeing the role that religion can play in the civil rights movement. His father and his mother were both very active in it. It's something that he grew up in, but he wanted it to be a little bit more academic than his father when it came to his preaching. And when he ended up graduating and going on to Crozier, which I will talk about later, that definitely was a part of it. So he ends up graduating, like I said, with a BA in sociology in 1948. And that is a picture of him and his sister. They graduated the same year. He graduated from Morehouse and she graduated from Spelman College. And it was an HBCU, which means a historically Black college or university. And they were started basically as a higher education. Most institutions of higher education weren't letting Black people in. So they were started, and they were sister schools. So at this time, they graduated the same day. They look very much alike in their graduation hats and gowns. So he finishes with his BA and decides that he is going to go off and he is going to go to Crozier. So this is the first connection that I really found in this area. So when I say Philadelphia, I'm kind of saying Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. So Crozier was in Chester, Pennsylvania. And when I think of Crozier, I always think of the medical center, but there was also a theological seminary, which no longer exists in Chester. It actually combined in the 1960s with another seminary and moved up to Rochester, New York. But in this time, he went there, instead of going to a seminary in the South, he really wanted to experience the North. He wanted to break free and kind of distance himself, not necessarily from the ministry, but the style of ministry that his father was in. This picture is actually the cover of a book called The Seminarian by Patrick Parr, which goes into detail about his time in Chester, Pennsylvania, and actually his auditing of the courses in the University of Pennsylvania. So during this time, he learned about Gandhi while he was in his undergraduate. He started exploring more and incorporating Gandhi and his peace work into his theology during this time period. He was one of only 11 African-American students at this time. And when he graduated, he did graduate at the top of his class. He was the valedictorian, which they didn't just take grades into account. What's interesting, if you see his transcripts, and that you can see some of his transcripts in the book and it's online, he didn't necessarily get straight A's, but he was like the president of the student body. He did a lot of work in the community, and he was a burgeoning leader from there. That time, he was also trying to decide where he wanted to go off to school. and he received a scholarship from Crozier, at which he used to enroll into Boston University. And that's eventually where he got his doctorate from. So on June 18th, 1953, that's where he marries Coretta Scott. They were introduced by a friend called Mary Powell, and because King was interested, wanted to meet a nice Southern woman. So Scott originally did not want to talk to him because she didn't want to marry a preacher, and she didn't want all the responsibilities that came along to being a preacher's wife. She was in school at the New England Conservatory of Music, and King's parents were actually kind of concerned because she was doing a lot of secular music, and she seemed like she wanted a career that was more focused on that rather than being a preacher's wife. But Martin Luther King was stubborn and he wanted to marry her. They fell in love and that happened, and they married on her parents' lawn. One of the things I found was interesting in 1953, she did have the part of the ceremony where to obey your husband removed from the ceremony, which was very unusual for that time. And I thought it was a very interesting fact. They went on and they had some children. There's Yolanda, which was her oldest, and she unfortunately died at the age of 51 from a heart attack. There was Martin Luther King the third, Dexter, and Bernice. And so that's a nice little family photo. So we're going to jump ahead and we're going to look at December 1st, 1955, which we really know this woman. So a part of this presentation is not just, it is about Martin Luther King, but I also just wanted to talk about his support system and the other people who were also involved. So this is December 1st, 1955, and this is Rosa Parks, a very famous photo of her. We know her as the woman who did not get up. She sat in her seat, and there was so much more to the story. She's definitely seen as the figurehead of the beginning of the boycott. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the other figures that were also involved. So her and Virginia Durr were two women who also did a lot of fundraising for a case for Claudette Colvin, who is a person who is getting more attention now. She was actually a person earlier that year who also did not get up. She was 16 and pregnant, and she wasn't necessarily the picture of what people wanted for the movement, but she was close to Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks encouraged her to be more involved in the youth branch of the NAACP, the Youth Council. So this is Rosa on December 1st. She started this because she didn't want to get up. She shouldn't have to. And then on December 5th, that's when Martin Luther King comes in a more a role that brings a lot of weight to this movement. And so at this point, you have to remember that over 70% of the city's buses were actually used by African Americans at that point. And it was 90% starting from that time that they started the boycott. It was 90% effective among. So 70% of that, over 70% of the people who were actually using the bus, 90% of them weren't actually going to be on there. So they lost about 30,000 to 40,000 bus fares each day. And so when we think about the bus, I think some people think there's just a bus and there's like a line, a clear demarcation between where the white people were supposed to sit in the front and where the Black people were supposed to sit. But it wasn't really like that. It was you sitting down, and if you were Black and a white person sat behind you, you had to get up and move behind them. And eventually, if all the seats were filled, or if the white person decided they wanted to sit at the back of the bus, you were just standing. Even if every other seat was empty, if someone wanted to sit in the back, you had to stand because you could not be in front of that person. So imagine coming home from work, being tired, knowing that you have to cook or clean and do things for your house, and all you really want to do is just sit. And you can. One of the things that happened, and that's a part of what happened to the third woman, Mary Louise Smith, who actually did it in October. So remember, December 1st was when Rosa Parks did it. During earlier that year, there was Claudette Cloven, who I said she was also arrested, but had the full support of the NAACP at that time. There was Aurelia Browder, Mary Louise Smith, and Susie McDonald, who all did it during that year. There was actually a fifth woman named Janetta Reese as well. So what happened is that they filed a lawsuit. Originally, these 5 women filed a lawsuit against Gail, which was the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama at that time. And during that lawsuit, Janetta was intimidated, and so she pulled out. So there was a financial protest in addition to this legal action that was happening concurrently. So there was many different prongs of things that were working. So this made its way up to the Supreme Court. There was a 3-person panel, judging panel that ruled that it was unconstitutional to have the segregated buses in that type of way. And they appealed it up to the Supreme Court, which held up the ruling. So on December 20th, 1956, 381 days later, it was declared that it was to desegregate the bus. So lots of money was lost during this time period. In 2019, there was actually a statue that was unveiled in Alabama, not too far away from the bus stop that Rosa Parks got on the bus at on December 1st. And so that's the statue, if you want to go visit it. And there's a placard that have near the statue that have before a woman's name, and that right there, the other woman is Mary Louise Smith. She came to the ceremony. I swear I am going to get to more of Martin Luther King, but I always like knowing about the other people in the movement as well. And so this, and the reason why they chose December 1st was because it was the 64th anniversary of Rosa Parks not giving up her seat. So let's move back into actually Martin Luther King, and again, more connections with the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. So it's estimated that between 1957 and 1968, that he traveled over 6 million miles and spoke more than 2,500 times. And so I would like to highlight some of the speeches that happened in this area. There is a really extensive list of a lot more, but I'm just going to choose some of the ones that I found interesting. I will, in the document I sent afterwards, will give you a more robust list. So this one was a commencement speech that he delivered at Lincoln University, and it was called The American Dream. And it's so this was him at Lincoln University, also receiving an honorary doctorate during that time as well. And a part that really struck me from that speech was is this quote. It's in a real sense, America is essentially a dream as yet unfulfilled. So he did give the same speech at different places. So a part of his 2,500 times speaking, it wasn't a single speech. Each event has a different speech. Sometimes he had a menu of them that he would pick and choose from, which would be the best for different occasions. So this speech was given other places as well, but during the commencement speech on 1961, he did give it there. And that is just a copy of the program from that commencement. Going back during this time, we're also going to do one of the most famous speeches. So if you don't know me, I am first generation American. My family it comes mainly from Barbados and Jamaica. Not that Martin Luther King doesn't have a connection with Jamaica. He actually received the keys to Kingston, Jamaica, actually. But I think he really played a different role in the West Indies than he did up in America. And so I have family members who, especially, we're country people from Jamaica. And the way they know him is that, oh, he's the I Have a Dream guy. And that's how the context of him. So this is one of the most famous speeches when you think of him. So this happened at the Washington Mall. It's the March in Washington, and that was attended by more than 250,000 people. So right there, this is one of the most famous ones, and you will see that there is a program right there about all of the different people who are speaking. So a part of the reason why I put this here, other than it just being this really influential speech, is that the connections to it. So this person, Bayard Rustin, who was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania, he served as an advisor to Martin Luther King during this time, and he was one of the main organizers logistically for the March on Washington, also getting people there. And a part of the reason why he was kind of erased from history, even though they're starting to bring him back in, is that at this point in the 1960s, he was a gay man, a Black gay man who formerly was a communist. No longer, he kind of gave that up by this point. So he was actually arrested at some point in a different state for not giving up his seat on a bus. He was arrested because he was a conscientious objector, so he refused to go to war when he was drafted. And so there was just he helped a lot with the logistics of this, and he also helped Martin Luther King move his theory of Gandhi and his practices over to practical purposes. There is a great documentary called Brother Outsider that goes into their relationship, as well as Bayard Rustin's impact overarching, which the library does own, that you can check out. And it's interesting because he also sang, so you'll hear his beautiful voice. I would highly recommend it. So again, he was born in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So there was that connection to the Pennsylvania area to that speech, but that was not the only one. So if any of you are basketball fans, college basketball fans, you may know this gentleman, George Raveling, who is still alive today. He was a former basketball player for Villanova, and he's a celebrated college basketball coach. And he was present at the speech. So if you look at the picture that is at the top right, I'm really bad with my directions, so as far as me, but the black and white, the one that's up at the top, George is there. He is standing next to Martin Luther King. There's a rabbi who is speaking currently, and so Martin Luther King is waiting to go on. So a part of it is a couple days before he decided the march happened, him and his friend decided they were going to go. And because there were these just kind of like tall, gangly guys, and they were like, oh, do you guys want to work security? So he found himself next to Martin Luther King working security during that time. They were just like, just stand there. So he stood there while this whole speech was unfolding. So the speech, the I Have a Dream speech was written out, and it was distributed, the copies of it was distributed to the press. So they would have an accurate copy of it to print in in their papers. But the part that I think everyone knows, the part that Mahalia Jackson inspired him to say was the I Have a Dream part was actually improvised and was not included in the original speech. So he goes off script, but Martin Luther King did have a copy of what he was supposed to say during that time. So he finishes this speech, and we know the speech, and if you haven't heard it, I will include a link to a recording of it. He finishes it, and he's about to fold up his speech, and Raveling said, "Can I have that?" And Martin Luther King said, "Sure," and he gives him that. And so Raveling takes it back and puts it into a copy of a book that was a signed book from one of the presidents, and I can't remember, the name's escaping me. And he just left the copy of the speech that Martin Luther King had during that speech in this book until he realized what he had. And in 2014, someone did try to buy that copy from him for $3 million. but he actually decided that he was going to donate it to Villanova. I don't know what Villanova is going to decide to do with it. Some people say that it definitely should be in archives, somewhere else. But yeah, so in 2021, that he decided that he was going to do that instead of selling it. So there's a picture of him later on with the speech that he had framed, and he actually did connect a lot of memorabilia and a lot of ephemera from that time period, but he ended up keeping this in a separate climate controlled locked place, not with the rest of his things. So that was another connection that we're getting to this area. It's that we're going to, at least Villanova, which is not too far away, will also have that copy. Let's go back to just Martin's life overall in general. In 1964, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent struggle for civil rights for the Afro-American population. One of the things, parts of that speech, his acceptance speech, that I love, and I obviously don't have the resonant voice that he has, but it really struck me, was, I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe on what self-centered men have torn down, men of other-centered can build up. And so that's always something that really struck me from that acceptance speech. I also think that's a part of the reason why later on, when Hoover created the file where the FBI was have been following him, it's a part of the reason why they probably put that in there, because there was he got accused of being a communist a lot during his time around. And in 1964, when he received this prize, he was at that point the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Another connection is another speech. It's a Villanova one. He gives a speech at Villanova in 1965, and there were about 4,000 students, faculty, and community members, because he loved having community members come in, especially in these academic spaces, for them to hear his speeches. And Villanova continues, for at least for the past 20 years, they celebrate his life and legacy by having speeches that are related to the social justice movement, related to at Villanova. They had them virtually for the past couple of years, but they are in person. And again, they are normally open to the public. So during this speech, which was one of the things that was special, is that he was expounding about the Civil Rights Act, which was only passed 6 months earlier from this. This one was another one that I thought was interesting. I didn't know about this one growing up. It's more of the one I came across, but I've heard of Girard College. And growing up in Philadelphia, one of the things about Girard College I always heard is like, oh, at a certain point, if you were a Black person, if you're a Black girl, especially if you're a Black person, you were not allowed in this school. So if you don't know about Girard College, it's a full scholarship boarding school that was founded in 1848 that was in Philadelphia. And it was started only for white male orphans by a philanthropist named Stephen Girard, who was also very anti-religion as well. So as the neighborhood that's around Girard College started changing, the community said, how can you create a school or have a school in the community that we cannot go to? So there was a lot of protests during that time. And Martin Luther King was traveling, like I said, he was traveling all around so many miles. During that time, he did stop in Philadelphia during some of his rallies. And he worked with Cecil B. Moore, who was the person who was the head of doing all of these protests, who started actually in May of 1965, picketing and bringing a lot of attention to it. So he worked with him during this time. And if you, Cecil B. Moore is not just a train stop in Philly, he is a very important person in the Philadelphia civil rights movement as well. So this speech is a rally that he was giving in August to the people. So eventually Girard College was desegregated in 1968. But again, it was a very long struggle between it. Like it started beforehand with Cecil B. Moore, and another prominent person is Raymond Pace Alexander, who honestly I don't know as much as I should about during that time. But while it was integrated in 1968, it was all male until 1982. And clergymen were allowed to be on campus until the 80s as well. So even if it wasn't a place where they were not letting Black people in, Martin Luther King still wouldn't have been allowed on campus because, again, Stephen Girard was very anti-religion, so he wouldn't have let him there anyway. So actually, this 2021, November 2021, they unveiled a mural in Philadelphia, and this is partially about Cecil B. Moore and that movement. And so the person who is in front, his name is Kenneth Salam. And he is one of the people who were called the freedom fighters at that point. But he, along the Cecil B. Moore freedom fighters, were a part of the people who were actively working to desegregate that school. So if you want to visit that, it's added onto the Philadelphia Murals tour. That same time, there is, like I said, he was at what was called the Freedom Now tour. And so he gave a speech at 40th and Lancaster, and this is about approximately 10,000 people there. And so like now think of this after, after this, all this time of social distancing, just looking at this picture is making me hyperventilate. Just there's so many people packed in, but all these people are there to listen to King's speech. So he was talking about the importance of the local civil rights movement and his goal of creating coalitions to just address these common concerns in amongst the community. So one of the things I will be sending you afterwards is there's a recording of this speech as well. So if you want to listen to it, that you're able. But this was the same speech he gave while he was traveling all over the place. And there's another mural. This one is at that intersection, and it's by Cliff Eubanks, and there's also a bus there as well. One of the other ones that I remember hearing, and I'm not sure if everyone actually listened to this, but I know growing up in Philadelphia, it's one of the speeches that were played for us, and at least in the public schools in Philadelphia during my youth. What's your life blueprint? So this the speech was one that he actually started developing, and then eventually while he was at Crozier, and over the years he perfected it. And again, I will be sending you a copy of that on YouTube that you can listen to as well. So this is it was a public school in Philadelphia. And the gist of the speech is that he was encouraging students to be their best selves, regardless of their status in life. And this happened on October 26th of that year. And I just remember listening to it and just back in the 90s when I was in grade school, and how it resonated then. And I re-listened to it again as an adult. And still, there are very salient points that were still being made, and it still connect. So it's a very evergreen speech, in my opinion. So I don't know if anyone ever recognized this picture, especially in certain communities. There is a lot of conspiracy theories that surrounds the death of Martin Luther King. So this picture, people are saying that after after he was shot in Memphis. He was alive and recovering. And then the FBI came and they smothered him. And this is the picture to prove that he was alive. And that is false. I don't know if anyone's heard it. I've heard it a lot, and I've tried to dispel that rumors that it's not correct. So there is just a lot of speculation around his death in certain communities. Even on Nobel Peace Prize page, they say something to the effect of like it's still not sure if King's murderer acted alone, or was he a part of a larger conspiracy. And I keep seeing this picture attached to that, but it's not from the time that he died. If you don't know, in September 20th, 1958, he was attacked and he almost died during that time. During that time, he was in Harlem and he was signing copies of his book, Stride Toward Freedom. And this woman came up to him and she said, "I've been looking for you for 5 years." And then he stabbed him with a 7-inch letter opener into his chest. And so she was arrested. He underwent emergency surgery. And so for the picture previously is him recovering from that assassination attempt. Oh, pardon me. So he was told that if he just sneezed, his punctured aorta would have killed him. So he stayed in bed for weeks until he recovered. And he also released a statement just going back into like I felt sorry for this woman and reaffirming his principles of nonviolence during this time, and that he tried to make sure that people understood that he had no ill will towards this woman because she did have some mental health issues. She ended up dying in, I believe, cannot remember off the top of my head, but she didn't die too long ago. But she was institutionalized for her rest of her life. So she thought that Martin Luther King, as well as the other top people of the NAACP, were a part of this larger conspiracy, and she felt like she had to take some of them out. So that was a part of what was happening. So there was another speech that I always find very haunting. It was his final performance or final speech that he gave on April 3rd, 1968. And it's "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And during that speech, he referenced the first assassination attempt. He talked about receiving a letter from all these people, letters, flowers, all these well wishes. And the one that stuck out to him was this white schoolgirl who just basically said, "Thank you for not sneezing. I'm so glad you didn't sneeze." And he said, "I'm glad I didn't sneeze too. And I wouldn't have been here to see the people do the boycotts or the lunch counters, all of these different events that was really people moving forward the civil rights movement, not just him, but all of the people who were working together to get laws passed, who were making all these movements." And he ends the speech with, "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountaintop, and I've looked over and I've been seeing the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And just listening to the entire speech and then knowing this date has always been very eerie to me, because the next day at a little after 6 p.m., he was fatally wounded at the Lorraine Motel in the Memphis, Tennessee. This is a place that he'd stayed many times before. And this is him. And then shortly afterwards, he was shot. he was there to support sanitation workers during their strike. And he was struck and severed his spinal cord, and he was only 39 years old. And hearing about Martin Luther King, hearing about his life when I was younger was very different because 39 felt so far away. But as a person who's now in my 30s, I just realized how short his life was. It actually came to fruition. I was like, I'm going to, knock on wood, outlive him. But it also is like how much impact he had during that time period. And it's just always very eerie just knowing what he said in the funeral and his speech the day before. So the Philadelphia Inquirer did cover his death. So even above the Philadelphia Inquirer's name is Dr. King shot to death in Memphis. And there were a lot of looting. I know Chicago and there were different places that the way that they expressed their grief was through riots and through looting. And so that was partially what was covered. I did take a look at the Souderton Independent. It was a local paper in Souderton Independent. I was weekly at that point. I did look through April of all of that year as well into May to see if there was any mention of the assassination, and there wasn't, but it was very focused on very local news during that time. So it wasn't, I didn't expect there to be any mention of it, but I just wanted to check to see. But it was mentioned in the Philadelphia Inquirer in a very prominent way. April 5th, this is actually in Philadelphia. I don't know if you guys can make it out, but there's a man who's in white, who's kind of above people, who is giving a speech. His name is Stanley Branch, who is he's a very interesting character himself. He deserves his own presentation, and definitely would not be as flattering as this presentation is for Dr. King. Overarching, but during this time, during this speech, when people were gathering at Independence Mall in Philadelphia on April 5th, he said that this country declared war when it killed this 20th century saint and prophet. So thousands gathered during this time. So during his funeral procession, he had went through the city, and he ended up in Morehouse, which again was his alma mater. And he at this podium, there's Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who was one of the people who definitely worked closely with him. He was actually at the, if you saw the pictures before, at the Lorraine Motel, he was with him during the time. But Coretta wanted parts of his speech. Now I'm blanking on the name. The drum major sermon that King gave to be played during parts of the morning ceremonies. And the drum major speech, if you read it or attempt to read it or listen to it, he talks about not wanting at his funeral or his death for people to talk about his accolades, about the prizes he won, about all of these other lofty things. He wanted to be remembered as a drum major for peace, a drum major for justice. And I think for me, he's trying to make sure people understand that you do not have to be special or into these lofty things. You don't have to be this leader in order to make a difference in people's lives. He wanted to be known that he had made efforts to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked and to comfort prisoners, that there are a lot of things that we can do in our own lives that would be similar to what he's doing. And so during part of his funeral, you heard recordings from that speech as well, which again is a little a little jarring as well, because that speech was given in February of 1968, so not too far off. So there's another, if you've ever listened to his eulogy that was given by Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College at that time. It was very jarring in some aspects because he pointed out, and in the modern society, we really think of Martin Luther King, we're kind of canonizing him in a sense where we're thinking of just all of the good things he's done, and we're kind of removing the man from his legacy. And in that speech, his eulogy, he really urged us not to do this. But he also talked about the responsibility of the society and his murder, and how we kind of let it happen by our attitudes. And it was a very interesting eulogy to read. And I would suggest if you have the opportunity to do that as well. One of the other things is that everywhere, it seems like, or at least definitely in Vietnam, these were soldiers in Vietnam who were having a memorial service on April 8th of 1968. King was a very outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War, because he couldn't support war, especially with his other principles. So while he was initially in the good favors of Lyndon B. Johnson at the time, because of his vocal opposition, he did have not necessarily a target on his back, but he was definitely watched because he was very vocally opposed. But that didn't stop people in Vietnam from memorializing him. And later that year, Coretta Scott King started the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, which is still around today. If you've ever visited it, the first time I visited in Alabama, there is he's interned there, so you could see his a memorial to him, and he's actually buried there. And then when I went back, when I was in college, I had the opportunity to go back, and that was after she passed away. And she is laid beside him. And then we go in, it's a very moving experience. And if you ever had a chance, I would suggest that. I also forgot to mention that the Lorraine Motel where he was murdered, they turned that into a museum as well that was very interactive. It's a very powerful place to be. And that's in Memphis, Tennessee. If you ever have the opportunity, you should go as well. It's interesting there is a protester who's been out there for many, many years. She was actually the last resident of the Lorraine Motel. So if you don't know, there are people who do live in motels, normally for financial reasons, because it's not something that you have to do the first and last and all these other things, security deposits and everything. But she lived there and they forcefully evicted her, and she's been protesting the museum ever since. And the other people I've talked to who's gone there, it's like, oh yeah, she was there. I was trying to find information if she was still there until 2022, but at least the last time I talked to someone who was there in 2019, she was still there. And a part of her thing was, it's always saying that the museum is more, it's not necessarily respectful to King's memory and legacy. It's more focused on the actions of the person who assassinated him, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's interesting that she's a prominent figure who's just like always there. Anyway, so we also have Martin Luther King Day becoming a holiday. So the efforts to start that, there was a representative from Michigan, John Conyers, who in April 6th of 1968, he introduced legislation to try to make it a federal holiday. And then in 1983, that's when Ronald Reagan signed it in, and it was first celebrated as a federal holiday in 1986. So completely completely unrelated, but sort of related, is that I don't know if any of you heard of the Uniform Monday Holiday Act. It's actually an act that was signed into law on June 1st of 1968, that was basically designed to create 3-day weekends. So these newer holidays were created go on Mondays. And so that's a part of the reason why, even though it's Martin Luther King Day, it doesn't necessarily happen on his birthday. It happens on that Monday, because of that act. So the first state to adopt it as a state holiday was Illinois in 1973. And then in 1987, there was an Arizona governor who Arizona was going to make it a state holiday, made it a state holiday. And in 1987, the first act of this new governor was to rescind Martin Luther King Day as his first act. And so that sparked off a whole bunch of boycotts and everything. The NFL actually said in 1991, if you don't move, do that, if you don't enact the holiday, we're going to move the Super Bowl to a different city. And Arizona called their bluff, and the NFL did end up moving in 1993 from Phoenix, Arizona to Pasadena, California, as a part of a protest for it. And then the citizens in 1992, they were going through votes and everything. Anyway, they ended up getting the Super Bowl back in 1996, but it was just very interesting that the first thing someone did was like, I'm just not going to have that there. And so it's right now, and it was fairly recently, it was only 12 years ago that all 50 states recognized it. I know that I have in-laws that live in Virginia, and certain parts of Virginia, they had it as Robert E. Lee Day, and that's the day that you got off, not just Martin Luther King Day. And so they try to emphasize that until fairly recently, which was always something that was very interesting. But that's a part of the reason why we celebrate it when we do. And so it's a day that we do use as a day of service, and it's trying to keep the man alive, not necessarily just the legacy, but his acts in line as well. So that's all I have for you tonight. I thank you for coming. So we have about 5 minutes. I'm going to stop my screen share. And if you have any questions, hopefully I'll be able to answer them for you. You can put them in the chat box or unmute yourself.
Hello.
Hi.
Are you representing the general area radiating out from Souderton?
I was starting from Philadelphia and then going out to the suburbs, and then I went a little bit further because I knew about I had some friends who graduated from Lincoln University, and that's one of the important surprise. They always talked about it. So I just started expanding, just knowing more about it. So my base that I started off was Philadelphia, mainly because I am from Philadelphia. I lived here, I still live here and grew up. And so that's where I started, and then radiated out.
One way in which that era woke up the local around Souderton Indian Valley area farmers who used to go to market at Ridge Avenue. And when the uprising came that changed that into the Cecil B. Moore Avenue, that really affected our economy here and sort of woke us up to realizing that things were changing. When our people went down there, we had a lot of African-American trade. I'm sorry how they said it, but I remember one man said, when they had money, they ate, and that fueled our economy up here. But we were pretty oblivious, to racial
Yeah, sometimes,
issues
yeah,
back
sometimes,
then. But
yeah,
that was a waking up time for us in the
yeah.
63, 64, 66.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. Yeah, sometimes we forget how interconnected we are. Um, so that's interesting. I should learn no more about that. Robbie wants to know if you did come across anything regarding him speaking at Temple. I did, but not as much. Temple has a wonderful archive. A lot of the things that I was trying to get from Temple, they're like, oh, you can come visit us, and then you can go through. So they don't have as much available online at some of the other universities. And that's a part of the reason why I didn't highlight Temple as much, but I know they definitely have a very strong archive for Black history in this area, which includes Dr. King speaking. Some of the pictures I do actually have are from the archives. They made some things available, but not as much, including some of the transcripts from his presentations, which hopefully one day, maybe when I retire, I get to, I can go and explore archives. That might be my retirement plan at some point. So thank you. I appreciate all the kind words. I really thank you for taking some time out to be a part of my presentation tonight. I'll see you at the library. We are open, and so I just appreciate all of you. I'm going to stop recording now. I will send out this